Okay, so if you've been following the discussion so far, we've talked about what body composition is and how to measure it. We've then talked about understanding or having an approach to understanding what to do about body composition, how to change your body composition for better health. And we emphasize that as a middle-aged woman or a woman approaching middle age, that every single one of us must be applying our fullest efforts to increasing muscle mass. There isn't an exception to this. There isn't anyone who can sit back and say, thanks, but I'm good. I have enough muscle to carry me straight through my 70s and 80s. So from that perspective, everyone needs to be applying their utmost efforts to gaining muscle mass. And in the subsequent talk to this, we're going to troubleshoot that muscle gain picture. But the other lever on that body composition dial is fat. And your body fat may presently be okay from an aesthetic and health standpoint, or it may be a little bit too high from a health perspective or for your personal aesthetic goals. So if this is the case, then we're going to talk about the challenges of losing body fat at our stage of life. Okay, I want to start by saying it is very challenging. It's not the same proposition as doing this when you're 25 years old. There are a number of mechanisms or reasons why this is the case. Age alone is associated with gains in body fat. Some of that is related to the loss of muscle. And in that regard, the muscle gain story is also related to this conversation, because preserving your muscle mass or even gaining more muscle will actually help you lose body fat. Muscular, has high energy demands, and is very insulin sensitive. Now, if you're confused about this story of insulin sensitivity and insulin responsiveness, I will do another separate talk, and I have done one, but it's very, very long, and you're welcome to search my YouTube channel. But the shorter snippet educational series is coming soon. Suffice it to say that muscle influences this tremendously. So as we lose muscle with age, there are a multitude of mechanisms that make fat loss very challenging and fat gain very easy. There's another concept called the body fat set point, which I'll talk about. Low cardio aerobic fitness through a multitude of mechanisms is also at play. The presence of visceral adipose tissue, which again is a marker of early insulin resistance, is at play. And of course, in certain circumstances, but this is in a minority of the population, it's not the majority of people, also are on medications, some including antidepressants or steroid medications that make it harder to lose fat or even cause fat gain. And certain medical conditions, certainly hypothyroidism or low levels of thyroid hormone. Now, if you're on thyroid replacement, this is no longer a concern. You're effectively euthyroid or normalized with your medication, and it's no longer a factor, okay? So let's get into each of these factors one at a time. The body fat set point is like the thermostat in a home that regulates the temperature within a narrow range. In much the same way, the human brain has something called the lipostat, which is responsible for regulating your body fat within a narrow range as well. And it can learn to adopt higher set points the longer you've sat at an elevated body fat percentage. So this speaks to the fact that if you've been at a certain body fat percentage for some time, your body is now telling itself that this is where it's supposed to be. So movement away from that in either direction, either gaining or losing, is going to have pushback mechanisms or compensatory mechanisms to bring you back to the set point. Unfortunately, the reality is that the compensatory mechanisms that kick in when we try to lose body fat are much stronger, and there are more of them than there are that push against fat gain to bring us back down. That makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because humans historically existed in times of energy scarcity. But in our modern time, where we have abundance of energy, food energy, I mean, this is maladaptive because it's much easier to gain weight than it is to lose. So you might be inclined to think, well, if this is the case, isn't this a lost cause? Well, no, it just means that you have to be careful about your approach. So oftentimes people want to accelerate fat loss. The problem is that the faster it is, especially at the beginning, the harder and quicker these compensatory mechanisms will kick back in. What kinds of things are we talking about? Down-regulating energy expenditure in other ways, as well as kicking your appetite back up, and inciting hormone responses that cause fat retention. So the way to get around this is to appreciate that actually slower fat loss is sustainable fat loss, because it's almost like slipping one under the radar of the lipostat. So if you're losing body fat at about a pound a week, okay, at the beginning, this is probably a good pace, and you don't want to go too much faster. Maybe at most 2 pounds per week, but that rate typically slows down, and that's related to these pushback mechanisms. And so I like to show this graph because often, in order to keep getting the outcome we want, in this case, more fat loss, the effort you have to put in isn't linear. So initially, with a certain amount of effort, you get a lot of response. The effort you have to keep putting in after that is going to have to be greater and greater and greater for lesser and lesser return. And that's just the nature of this. You're fighting against compensation. And it's just better to set yourself up with the right expectations rather than feel like you're failing. So when fat loss slows down, it's not stopping, but that's where people often lay off their approach because they think it's not working, or they feel frustrated and give up. You can't. In fact, you have to push a little further. You have to dial up a little bit more. You have to break through the plateau. And that plateau, we're going to talk about the best way to do that. But let's take a moment and talk about how age is playing a factor. We know that body fat tends to trend up and muscle mass trends down just by virtue of age. Now, you can fight against that with age, with exercise, because in reality, it's hard to parse out what is related to inactivity versus age. They tend to trend together. In the study of women's health across the nation, only 7% of women in middle age met basic physical activity guidelines. We're going to talk about what those guidelines are, but you can appreciate how if you're not meeting physical activity guidelines with age, it's really hard to understand how much is age by itself versus other things that happen with age, losing muscle because we're inactive, right? Developing insulin resistance because we're inactive. Menopause is often blamed for our fat gain. Directly, it's not causing fat gain. The loss of estrogen by itself isn't the cause of fat gain. And if it were the case, then absolutely all menopausal women everywhere would gain fat. And that's not the case. The majority do, but there are many confounding factors. We know that the ones who maintain their physical activity levels and prioritize as much as they can getting better sleep and eating a healthy, balanced diet tend to stave this fat loss off a lot better than those who don't. But menopause is affecting many things, and it's influencing fat gain on a number of levels by influencing our appetite. So oftentimes women describe that they have a greater appetite with this transition in hormones. Their mood is impacted, which then in turn affects sleep and appetite. Your energy can be lower. You have aches and pains you never had before. All of this is confounding the story, right? So it looks like the loss of estrogen is causing and progesterone are causing weight gain directly, but it's through all of these other influences on how you move your body that is usually the case. So this piece about fitness becomes paramount because your greatest tool, along with eating a balanced diet, is fitness. Now, we're talking about cardio aerobic fitness in this case. Muscle is its own intervention, and we will touch upon that in a bit. But here we're talking about cardio aerobic fitness as measured by what is called your VO2 max. Your VO2 max is a measurement of the maximum capacity your body has to take up oxygen and use it. And why is this a measure of fitness? Well, it's because the fitter you are, the more oxygen you can utilize to generate energy. Okay, now, not just like max measured is the gold standard for assessing your cardio aerobic fitness. Now, not everyone needs to do that because thankfully we have activity trackers that give us estimates. And just like an in-home body composition scale is not as accurate as a DEXA, it is precise enough to trend. And so you can trend any change in your VO2 max using these activity trackers. You can also use it to plot on a graph, just like we did for muscle mass and fat mass, to see where you sit relative to the population. And your VO2 max is a predictor of your lifespan. So people with higher VO2 maxes live longer. Those with lower VO2 maxes are not only likely to die younger, but also have a multitude of diseases. So this is a health discussion again, right? Fundamentally a health discussion above all else. You can be considered to have low fitness by other benchmarks. One is that you're not meeting current health authority guidelines for the minimums of cardio aerobic activity for good health. The current guidelines in Canada and the US are very similar, is to get a minimum of 150 cumulative minutes of moderate intensity cardio aerobic activity every week. These are in bouts of at least 20 minutes sustained at a time. And you might say, well, how do I know where my heart rate should be? Well, it's going to be different depending on your current level of fitness, just like your current level of strength is different from someone else. So if I say bench press for 10 reps with dumbbells, person A who's stronger is going to lift heavier weights for 10 reps than someone who's just starting out and is a little bit weaker. Similarly, what is a moderate level of activity for some people is a brisk walk, while other people can jog and feel like this is a moderate level of activity. Personally, my benchmark for my clients is they should be able to sustain a heart rate between 125 and 135 for at least 45 minutes. And some might say, well, how could this apply to someone in their 60s? I assure you that there are plenty of people out there who are capable of doing this well beyond their 60s, okay? So it's not an age-dependent thing. Certainly, if you're in your 40s and can't do this, it's a very bad marker of low levels of fitness, because there are people in their 70s who can do this with ease, and it's just a function of training. So think less about your age. Don't let that be your ceiling, okay? You should be targeting this. Now, it's not a prescription for how to do a workout. That's beyond the scope of this discussion and may require some personal consultation, because again, it depends on what you're comfortable doing, what your current level of fitness is. But certainly there are many fitness apps out there that will give you some sense of programming to do these things. Let's move on to this story of visceral adipose tissue and how it can influence your attempts to lose body fat. In a cruel kind of reality, this fat in the visceral space is actually making further fat gain very easy and fat loss very, very hard. So this may explain why you feel like you're making a lot of efforts, but the efforts are not leading anywhere, because you have this resistance to fat loss and it's being driven by this visceral adipose tissue. It's because, and the mechanisms are beyond the scope of this conversation, but in a simple explanation, this fat is inflammatory, and inflammation inhibits fat breakdown, as does insulin resistance. And we know having visceral adipose tissue or fat tissue in and around your organs and in your muscles, without mitochondria, I'm going to say, that's part of the exercise piece, causes insulin resistance. And this state of inflammation and insulin resistance makes fat loss, fat burning essentially very, very difficult. And so it's not something that shows up on blood work, but if you're someone with an elevated waist circumference or a presence of excess adipose tissue in the visceral space on DEXA, you can reasonably expect that fat retention will occur, and you will have challenge losing body fat and gaining muscle. Now, you might again feel quite discouraged, but what it means is you're simply going to have to move your dials a little bit more, okay? And what are those dials that I'm talking about? There are 3 dials at your disposal when it comes to considering fat loss, approaches to fat loss. The big one is nutrition, and others are exercise and the recovery system, or sleep and stress management. They go together, they're inextricably linked. Exercise and sleep stress we'll discuss in a little less detail, because the big dial is nutrition. Why do I say that? Because let's imagine, to illustrate, if you put someone in the woods and left them there with no food for 3 days, maybe they would sit there and they wouldn't exercise at all, and they wouldn't sleep very well, and they'd be very stressed, but they wouldn't gain weight. So inactivity by itself, or low levels of exercise and lots of stress or poor sleep alone, can't drive fat gain in the absence of excess calories. So this is why nutrition becomes the center dial, because you can't gain or accumulate excess energy storage, which is what body fat represents, if you're not bringing that energy in the first place, right? So the body fat that you have represents long-term excess energy consumption. So it had to come in order to be stored. It didn't just appear, right? It's energy, and energy is converted from one form to the other. And it's also not useful to look at the last few days or the last month. It's really a reflection of longer term tendencies and trends and overconsumption of energy relative to what your body has historically needed in terms of energy expenditure. So the nutrition piece cannot be ignored. By ignoring it and only dealing with exercise and that I need, the habits I need to do, and I'm implementing them with 90% consistency over long periods of time. Okay, so that's a top score. If you're killing it, you get a 10 on 10. Now consider each area, each dial: nutrition, exercise, and sleep/stress recovery. So in each area, you're going to give yourself a score. Don't overthink it. Just the first number that comes to mind is the one that's correct. And you're basically now going to listen to the subsequent talks, which breaks down each of these things in a little bit more detail to give you an idea of where you're going to put your first efforts.